The morning sunlight streamed through the tall, arched windows of the courthouse, casting long lines of light across the polished wooden floors. The air was thick with the scent of polished oak, paper, and the faint tang of coffee carried in by the courthouse staff. Outside, a modest crowd had gathered, journalists with microphones, camera crews adjusting lenses, and a handful of curious citizens hopping to catch a glimpse of a high-profile case. Inside, the atmosphere was much different. It was tense, formal, and heavy with anticipation. Lawyers whispered hurriedly to each other, flipping through files and adjusting suits, while bailiffs patrolled the aisles with eyes sharp and alert. Every step, every shuffle of paper, seemed amplified in the echoing chamber. In the middle of this solemn environment, a tiny figure entered quietly, almost unnoticed. Leela, a 3-year-old girl with curly chestnut hair and bright, curious eyes, clung to her mother's hand as they stepped into the courtroom. Her small pink shoes clicked softly on the floor. She was too young to understand the gravity of the legal proceedings around her, but her wide eyes reflected a mix of curiosity, nervousness, and wonder. This was a world of adults, strict, serious, and intimidating, and she felt both excited and slightly overwhelmed. Her mother, Samantha, adjusted Leela's coat, trying to calm her fluttering nerves. "Stay close, honey. It's important to be quiet here," she whispered, keeping her voice soft so as not to draw attention. Leela nodded, though her gaze wandered immediately, scanning the unfamiliar room. The courtroom was vast, with high ceilings adorned by ornate moldings. Rows of dark wooden benches stretched back toward the gallery, where citizens and reporters sat in silence, waiting. At the front, behind a tall bench, the judge sat in imposing authority, a gavel resting within easy reach. Among the officers present, one figure caught Leela's attention immediately, a large German shepherd sitting obediently near the entrance. His name was Rex, a police dog trained for both protection and calm demeanor. His coat was sleek, dark brown with a hint of black along his back, and his eyes were sharp yet gentle. Even in a room full of tension, he exuded a quiet authority, sitting alert but relaxed, tail tucked neatly to the side. Leela froze for a moment, her tiny hand gripping her mother's fingers. There was something about Rex that drew her in, something steady and reassuring. While the adults around her were tense and serious, Rex's calm presence was magnetic. As the bailiff called the courtroom to order, the hum of whispered conversation subsided. Leela tilted her head, her curiosity overpowering her fear. She whispered to her mother, "Doggy," pointing at Rex. Samantha smiled quietly, brushing a loose curl from Leela's forehead. "Yes, honey, that's Rex. He's a police dog," she explained softly. Leela's gaze stayed fixed on the German shepherd, fascinated by his stillness and apparent intelligence. While adults fussed with legal documents and prepared arguments, Leela was captivated by a being who seemed to belong in a different world entirely, one of loyalty, calm, and quiet observation. The judge began to speak, his voice deep and authoritative, filling the room with an immediate sense of gravity. "This courtroom is now in session," he announced, gavel striking sharply. The echo reverberated through the walls, causing some in the gallery to straighten in their seats. Leela flinched slightly at the sound, pressing closer to her mother. Yet her attention never wavered from Rex, who remained unmoved by the noise and chaos around him. To her, he was a silent guardian, an anchor in a sea of solemnity and stress. Lawyers began presenting documents, the sharp rustle of papers punctuating the weighty words of opening statements. Leela's attention, however, was divided. Every time someone moved near Rex, her eyes followed, wide with fascination. She whispered again, "Doggy, hi," under her breath, barely audible. The officer beside Rex smiled faintly, accustomed to both public attention and the unexpected innocence of children in his presence. Rex shifted slightly, acknowledging the tiny figure with a tilt of his head, his ears flicking in recognition. That brief gesture, almost imperceptible, would be the first spark of human connection in a room otherwise dominated by law, rules, and solemnity. Despite her small size and the overwhelming nature of the room, Leela's presence began to alter the energy subtly. Jurors, previously engrossed in documents and serious discussion, caught glimpses of the child pointing toward Rex. A few smiled faintly, almost unconsciously. Even attorneys in their precise suits and sharp demeanor allowed themselves a brief glance, noting the contrast between the innocent curiosity of a toddler and the disciplined professionalism of a police dog. The stark difference between childhood wonder and the seriousness of justice highlighted a strange but comforting juxtaposition. Leela's mother noticed the effect her daughter was having, both on those around her and on herself. "It's incredible how children can change a room," Samantha whispered to herself, watching as Leela continued to observe Rex intently. Her daughter's gaze was unwavering, full of questions she couldn't yet articulate, and yet full of trust and fascination. Rex, ever the professional, remained calm, but the tension in the room softened imperceptibly. It was a subtle shift, almost unnoticeable to those focused on the legal proceedings, but significant enough to mark the beginning of a small but memorable story within the walls of the courthouse. The courtroom, with its polished wood, solemn faces, and heavy responsibility, had never felt quite like this before. In one corner, a 3-year-old girl discovered fascination. In another, a police dog provided a calm, steady presence. The two, seemingly worlds apart, were connected by the unspoken language of curiosity, trust, and quiet observation. As the judge continued with procedural instructions, Leela's eyes never left Rex, and for a brief moment, the tension, the seriousness, and the weight of law were all softened by the unexpected combination of innocence and loyalty. For Leela, the courtroom wasn't just a room of rules and authority. It was a place where she had met a gentle guardian, a dog whose presence was comforting and captivating. For the adults around her, it was a momentary glimpse of something rare: the power of simple curiosity to humanize, to create warmth amid solemnity, and to remind even the most serious of people that moments of connection could exist anywhere, even in the most formal of settings. As the session officially began, Leela clutched her mother's hand tightly but kept her gaze on Rex. She did not yet understand what was happening, nor the weight of the legal proceedings around her. Yet she felt a sense of security, a small wonder, and a spark of joy that would linger long after this day. In the midst of authority, discipline, and tension, the quiet presence of a child and a dog became a moment of serenity, a pause before the storm, and the first chapter in a story that would capture hearts far beyond the courthouse walls. The courtroom hummed with a tense rhythm as lawyers whispered strategies and jurors shifted in their seats. Every sound, the rustle of papers, the shuffle of shoes, the muted coughs of spectators, was magnified in the solemn space. Leela, seated quietly on her mother's lap, continued to observe her surroundings with wide, curious eyes. Despite the authority and seriousness that filled the room, her gaze never strayed far from the German shepherd sitting near the front. Rex, with his sleek coat glinting under the fluorescent lights, exuded an air of calm and focus, entirely composed despite the gravity around him. Leela's small hand shot out, pointing again. "Doggy," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the formal proceedings. Samantha, her mother, leaned down and whispered back, "Yes, that's Rex. He's a very special police dog." Leela's tiny fingers trembled slightly with excitement as she watched Rex's ears flick in acknowledgement. The dog's trained composure gave her an unexpected sense of comfort. He was steady, unthreatening, and yet majestic. For Leila, who had never been in such a serious environment before, the presence of Rex turned an intimidating courtroom into a space where wonder could exist, even if just for a moment. Across the room, jurors began to notice the little girl's attention. A few exchanged quiet glances, their faces softening ever so slightly. One juror, a middle-aged man who had spent years behind a desk in a large law firm, couldn't help but smile subtly as he watched the tiny figure point and murmur happily. Even the stenographer, focused on capturing every word of testimony, paused for a second to glance at Leela. In a space dominated by procedure, schedules, and rules, a child's curiosity was almost revolutionary. It reminded everyone present that the world could still contain moments of innocence. Rex, trained to maintain calm regardless of distraction, lifted his head ever so slightly. His intelligent brown eyes met Leela's gaze for the briefest moment. There was no command, no reward, yet the dog responded in a way that seemed almost human. Leela giggled softly, a tiny musical sound that carried faintly through the room. The tension in the courtroom, thick and unyielding moments before, softened perceptibly. Lawyers who had been furiously reviewing notes allowed their shoulders to relax. Even the judge's expression, previously etched with strict authority, held the faintest trace of curiosity and warmth. The moment was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to shift the energy. Leela's fascination with Rex seemed to create a ripple, gently nudging the adults around her toward a shared acknowledgement of something rare and unexpected. A brief intersection of innocence and duty. While the trial continued, and lawyers presented their points with the usual precision, Leela's soft whispers and gentle pointing became a quiet counterpoint, a reminder that life existed beyond legal arguments and courtroom protocols. Her mother, Samantha, felt a mixture of pride and surprise. "She's really captivated by him," she murmured to the person sitting next to her. "She's never seen a real police dog before." The neighbor smiled, nodding, understanding immediately the magic of the moment. Leela continued to observe Rex with rapt attention, occasionally tilting her head or whispering soft questions that only her mother could hear. "Is he nice?" she asked. "Yes, very nice," Samantha replied, smiling down at her daughter. The exchange was simple, yet it encapsulated a universal truth. Children notice what adults often overlook, and animals respond in ways that transcend words. In the front row, the officer responsible for Rex noticed the child's fascination. He had seen Rex interact with the public countless times, demonstrations, training exercises, and tense situations, but never had he observed a child so captivated and a dog so attuned. Rex had been trained for focus, for authority, for protection, but here, he was also a gentle companion, bridging the gap between adult authority and childlike wonder. The officer allowed himself a rare smile, proud of his partner and of the effect this simple interaction had on the courtroom's energy. The judge, noticing the brief moments of attention, allowed a short pause in proceedings. "It seems we have a small fan of the K-9 unit," he said, his voice holding a hint of amusement. Leela's mother nodded quickly, whispering reassurance to her daughter. The room remained serious, but the collective tension had softened. Jurors leaned back in their seats slightly, lawyers adjusted their ties or straightened their jackets with less rigidity, and a few witnesses even glanced toward the small scene unfolding near the front. The pause lasted mere seconds, but it was enough to leave an imprint, a subtle but meaningful shift in atmosphere. Rex, ever the professional, remained seated, his head slightly tilted, ears alert but calm. He did not move toward Leela, yet there was a silent acknowledgement in his gaze. Leela's laughter bubbled up quietly, and the judge smiled once more, tapping his gavel lightly before returning to proceedings. The courtroom was no longer just a place of authority and tension. It had become a stage for human connection, however fleeting. Innocence had carved a tiny space in a world dominated by rules and serious matters. As testimony began, Leela continued to observe, her little eyes darting between Rex and the adults around her. Every so often, she whispered questions to her mother, giggling softly when Rex responded with a gentle twitch of his ears or a shift in posture. For Samantha, the moment was unforgettable. She had expected the courtroom to be rigid, intimidating, and overwhelmingly serious. Yet her daughter's presence, combined with the calm dignity of a police dog, transformed it into something more human. It was a reminder that even in the strictest environments, warmth, curiosity, and small gestures could thrive. Meanwhile, the jurors were increasingly aware of the contrast between Leela's fascination and the courtroom's gravity. One young juror, who had been skeptical about serving on the panel, found herself softened by the sight. She realized that while the legal system demanded logic and rigor, it was also made up of people capable of empathy and reflection. Leela's innocent gestures acted as a lens, magnifying humanity in a room otherwise defined by formality. Even the lawyers, engrossed in argument and procedure, allowed their expressions to relax for a moment, recognizing the subtle magic unfolding before them. The day stretched on, but Leela's presence and her fascination with Rex remained a quiet, persistent undercurrent. She did not interrupt, did not cry or fuss, but her attention was unwavering. Rex remained still, maintaining his trained posture, yet fully responsive in the only way that mattered, through silent acknowledgement. The courtroom had begun to feel different, less rigid, more alive, and subtly infused with empathy. In those small moments, it was clear that the bond between a child and a dog could influence more than just themselves. It could touch an entire room. By the time recess approached, Leela's cheeks were slightly flushed with excitement. She whispered to her mother, "Can I pet him?" Samantha smiled, though she knew the answer was no, given courtroom protocols. "Not yet, honey, but you can say hello with your eyes," she whispered back. Leela's small hand waved slightly in Rex's direction, and the dog's ears flicked one last time in acknowledgement. The moment lingered in everyone's mind. The innocence of a child, the calm dignity of a trained dog, and the subtle warmth that bridged them. The first part of the day's events would be remembered not for legal arguments or witness testimony, but for a quiet human connection. A small girl and a police dog, in the middle of a room dominated by procedure and authority, reminded everyone present that warmth and curiosity could exist even in the most serious spaces. The story, though unremarkable in official terms, had begun to weave itself into a narrative of subtle magic, one that would continue to unfold throughout the day and beyond. The courtroom had settled back into the rhythm of proceedings, the low hum of whispered conversations blending with the faint scratching of pens across legal pads. Lawyers presented their opening arguments with measured precision, and the jurors sat upright, eyes scanning every detail with disciplined attention. The judge's gavel punctuated statements with authority, signaling the seriousness of the case. Yet, amid this rigid atmosphere, a subtle ripple was forming, one that no one in the room had anticipated. Leela's gaze never wavered from Rex, the German shepherd sitting with flawless composure near the front. Her small hand had left the gentle grip of her mother's and now pointed at the dog again. "Doggy," she whispered, her voice soft but filled with awe. It was a word of simplicity, yet in the silent spaces between the courtroom's tense exchanges, it resonated more than anyone could imagine. The judge, mid-sentence, noticed the tiny figure pointing toward the K-9 officer. For the first time that morning, his stern expression softened slightly. "Is that our young fan interested in the K-9 unit?" he asked, his tone carrying a rare warmth. Leela's mother, Samantha, smiled and nodded, leaning close to explain. "She loves dogs, Your Honor. She's never seen a police dog before, and she's fascinated by him." The room, previously focused entirely on law and procedure, shifted imperceptibly. Jurors glanced down at Leela and exchanged quiet smiles. Lawyers paused for a fraction of a second, adjusting their ties and notes as their minds registered the scene. Even the court reporter, fingers poised over the stenography machine, allowed her eyes to flicker toward the child. The stillness of the moment contrasted sharply with the earlier flurry of legal activity, a gentle pause that held more weight than anyone realized. Rex, trained to maintain absolute focus, lifted his head just enough to acknowledge the tiny girl. His brown eyes, intelligent and calm, met Leela's gaze, creating a silent connection. No commands were given, no treats exchanged, just a shared recognition between child and dog, one that seemed to speak louder than any words could. Leela's lips curved into a quiet smile, her fingers pointing ever so slightly as if to say, "I see you." The subtle interaction did not go unnoticed. A juror, a young woman who had been anxiously reviewing the case file, found herself smiling against her will. "It's incredible," she whispered to her neighbor, "how something so small can change the energy in the room." Her colleague nodded, his eyes still on Leela and Rex. Even seasoned officers, accustomed to tense situations, allowed themselves a small moment of admiration. The air had shifted from strict formality to something warmer, more human. The judge, sensing the effect, allowed a brief pause in the proceedings. He leaned slightly forward, fingers steepled on the desk, and said softly, "Perhaps we could all take a moment to acknowledge our little guest and the impressive K-9 presence here today." A light murmur passed through the courtroom, but it was not disrespectful. Rather, it was a collective acknowledgement of the unusual yet heartwarming sight before them. Leela's eyes widened as the judge spoke to her indirectly, though she only understood the tone, not the exact meaning. Rex, remaining completely still, seemed almost aware of the effect he was having. His calm demeanor, his steady posture, and his quiet intelligence provided a counterbalance to the courtroom's usual tension. Leela leaned slightly toward her mother, whispering, "He's nice, Mommy." Samantha smiled, whispering back, "Yes, honey, he's very nice." The simplicity of the exchange, a child's innocent observation and a mother's gentle reassurance, resonated in the room more than the legal arguments could have at that moment. Outside the immediate circle, the courtroom's energy began to subtly adjust. Lawyers straightened their papers, not out of urgency, but as if the pause allowed them to breathe. Officers shifted in their seats, their hands relaxing from clenched positions. Jurors, who had been rigidly attentive, now occasionally exchanged glances with a hint of softness, a quiet smile tugging at corners of faces. Even the stenographer allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible chuckle. In these fleeting moments, a child's curiosity and a dog's calm had begun to ripple through the structured world of law, reminding everyone present of something they often forgot: humanity. The media in the gallery, sensing the subtle magic of the moment, leaned forward. Cameras adjusted lenses, microphones captured soft sounds, and reporters scribbled notes quickly. Even if they weren't planning a feature story yet, they instinctively knew something worth documenting had occurred. In the structured, predictable environment of the courtroom, nothing like this usually happened. A child pointing at a police dog was simple, yes, but it carried a quiet power to remind everyone that even in the gravest circumstances, moments of wonder could exist. As the pause lingered for several moments, Leela's fascination deepened. She leaned slightly closer to her mother, whispering again, "Doggy, look at me." Rex's ears flicked subtly and his eyes met hers once more. The child giggled softly, a sound like a bell in the otherwise serious room. The judge allowed himself a faint smile, fingers tapping lightly on the bench. Lawyers paused mid-sentence, adjusting their papers with distracted amusement. The jurors' expressions softened further, their tension easing, if only slightly. In the quiet of that brief pause, the courtroom became something more than a place of law. It became a space where connection could bloom unexpectedly. Leela's mother took note of the effect as well. She whispered softly, "See, honey, you're making everyone happy just by being curious." Leela's small face lit up, her attention unwavering. In that moment, the mother realized that her daughter's innocence had a subtle power. It wasn't loud or demanding. It didn't disrupt the proceedings, but it softened hearts. For a few precious seconds, the courtroom was not just a space for legal arguments. It was a space of shared humanity, quietly influenced by a toddler and a police dog. Rex remained poised, his tail tucked neatly at his side, a picture of disciplined patience. The K-9 officer standing nearby couldn't help but feel a quiet pride. He had trained Rex for years to remain calm under pressure, to command attention without aggression, to project authority without intimidation. Yet here, in the presence of a child's fascination, Rex displayed a different kind of power, the power to soothe, to connect, and to inspire gentle smiles. For everyone watching, it was a subtle but profound lesson in empathy and restraint. The pause, though brief, left a lingering effect on the atmosphere. As the judge cleared his throat and resumed proceedings, the tension didn't return fully. Smiles remained tucked in corners, shoulders were less rigid, and eyes occasionally flicked toward Leela and Rex with affectionate acknowledgement. The courtroom's rhythm had been punctuated by innocence and calm, leaving an invisible mark on everyone present. It was a quiet reminder that even in spaces of strict rules and authority, moments of connection, curiosity, and empathy could prevail. Even as lawyers continued with testimony, Leela whispered softly, "Doggy, I like you." Rex, still focused yet aware, offered the slightest tilt of his head. In that tiny gesture, a bond was affirmed, one that required no words but carried immense meaning. The jurors, officers, and court staff couldn't ignore it. They felt the warmth, however subtle, that flowed from this unlikely pair. In a room defined by gravity and duty, the smallest beings, the toddler and the dog, had reminded everyone present of the beauty of observation, patience, and mutual respect. By mid-morning, the courtroom had adapted to the quiet energy that Leela and Rex had introduced. Proceedings continued, testimony was given, evidence presented, and arguments made, but underneath it all, a shared humanity persisted. Leela's fascination had created a bridge between innocence and authority, playfulness and professionalism, childlike wonder and disciplined calm. And though no one would mark it in the official record, the brief pause had changed the mood in a room that usually knew only seriousness. As recess approached, Samantha whispered to Leela, "Soon, we can go say hi to Rex outside." Leela's eyes sparkled, her fingers pointing once more toward the obedient dog. Rex remained still, his presence a steady anchor amid the sea of human tension. For the first time that morning, Leela felt entirely at ease in the courtroom. And for the adults who had been silently observing, a quiet lesson had been imparted. That sometimes, even in the most formal spaces, a child's innocence and a dog's calm could remind everyone what mattered most: connection, compassion, and shared moments of wonder. After the brief pause, the courtroom slowly settled back into the formal rhythm of the day. The judge cleared his throat and resumed speaking, the gavel tapping sharply on the bench to punctuate his instructions. Lawyers adjusted their notes, officers straightened their stances, and the jurors returned their attention to the proceedings. Yet, despite the return to seriousness, the subtle warmth introduced by Leela and Rex lingered in the air, almost imperceptible, yet undeniably present. Leela, perched on her mother's lap, could hardly contain her fascination. She leaned slightly forward, pointing again at Rex. "Doggy, look at me," she whispered, her voice a soft, musical thread in the otherwise solemn courtroom. Samantha smiled down at her daughter, brushing back a loose curl. "Yes, honey, he sees you. Just be quiet for a little longer," she whispered, attempting to maintain decorum while secretly enjoying the magical moment unfolding before her eyes. Rex, the German shepherd, lifted his head slightly and met Leela's gaze. His trained composure never wavered, yet the subtle flick of his ears and the calm intelligence in his eyes conveyed acknowledgement. There was a silent communication between them, a gentle, wordless connection that seemed to pause the pressures of the day. Leela giggled softly, drawing the attention of a few nearby jurors, who exchanged small smiles, unable to resist the charm of the moment. Even the stenographer, previously buried in her notes, allowed herself a quiet, involuntary smile. The judge, noticing the small smile spreading throughout the courtroom, allowed the proceedings to slow slightly. "Let's continue," he said, but his tone carried a touch of warmth, a recognition that the courtroom, for once, was more human than usual. Lawyers resumed their statements, yet the room felt different. The energy had softened. The tension, while still present, had been punctuated by the innocence of a child and the calm dignity of a dog. Observers began to notice the subtle influence Leela and Rex had on the room. Jurors, who had been sitting rigidly, now leaned back slightly, their faces softened by the unusual scene. Officers, trained to maintain unwavering attention, allowed themselves a moment of appreciation. Even the gallery of reporters, cameras poised, paused as though sensing a story of human interest unfolding organically. In a space governed by procedure, protocol, and expectation, the simplest of gestures, a child pointing at a dog, had become transformative. Leela whispered softly again, "Doggy, hi," and Rex's ears twitched. The interaction was quiet, almost imperceptible to anyone not paying attention, yet its effect was profound. The juxtaposition of innocence and authority, of curiosity and discipline, reminded everyone present that even in the most rigid environments, warmth could seep through. One juror, a man in his 60s who had spent decades in corporate law, glanced at his neighbors and murmured, "I didn't expect to smile today, but that little girl, she's changed the mood." Samantha, watching her daughter, felt a deep sense of pride and amazement. "It's incredible how a child can affect a room," she whispered to herself. Leela, absorbed entirely by Rex, didn't yet understand her influence, nor did she need to. Her fascination was pure, uncalculated, and completely authentic, a stark contrast to the calculated precision of the adults around her. In this contrast, the courtroom found a rare moment of shared humanity. Even the lawyers, usually laser-focused on their arguments, found their expressions softening. One attorney, mid-sentence, allowed himself a faint smile as his eyes flicked toward the tiny figure pointing at the dog. Another, reviewing documents, paused for a moment to glance up. The brief human connection, innocent and unassuming, was enough to puncture the rigid formality of the room. The interaction reminded everyone present that law was not just about rules and evidence, but also about people, relationships, and the ability to recognize the humanity in each other. Rex remained perfectly still, a model of discipline, yet his presence was undeniably comforting. Children in particular, Samantha noted, responded instinctively to his calm authority. Leela's fascination, her quiet laughter, and the way she leaned slightly forward toward him were met with a gentle acknowledgement in his gaze. The subtle dynamic between them, a child's curiosity and a dog's patience, was quietly contagious. Adults who had been hardened by the pressures of responsibility found themselves reminded of something fundamental: the importance of empathy, observation, and shared understanding. The judge allowed another pause, speaking gently to the room. "Let's remember that we are all human in this space. Even in serious matters, a moment of connection can be meaningful." It was an unusual statement in such a formal setting, yet it reflected the shift in atmosphere perfectly. Leela's small gestures, Rex's steady presence, and the reactions of those around them had created a ripple of warmth and subtle amusement that the entire courtroom had felt. Observers in the gallery began exchanging quiet comments. One reporter whispered to a colleague, "This is going to be a story that touches people. A child, a dog, and a courtroom. It's unexpected and beautiful." Cameras adjusted, microphones tilted, and notes were scribbled, but the beauty of the moment was not fully captured in words or images. It existed in the shared, quiet acknowledgement of something rare. Innocence intersecting with authority, curiosity meeting discipline, and warmth piercing the formal shell of law. Leela whispered again, "He's so big, Mommy," and Samantha nodded, smiling down at her daughter. "Yes, honey, he's very big, but he's also very kind." Leela's giggles were quiet but musical, punctuating the rhythm of legal proceedings with a lightness that had been absent all morning. Even the officers nearby allowed themselves small smiles, exchanging quick glances that spoke volumes about their awareness of the unusual, heartwarming effect unfolding in front of them. For a moment, the courtroom felt less like a place of judgment and procedure, and more like a shared human space. The contrast between seriousness and playfulness, between authority and innocence, created a tension that was soft, almost imperceptible, yet powerful. It reminded everyone that small moments could leave lasting impressions, that children had a way of reminding adults what truly mattered, and that animals could serve as quiet bridges between hearts in ways words often could not. As proceedings resumed in earnest, Leela continued to whisper softly to her mother, occasionally pointing at Rex. Her presence was no longer merely tolerated. It was acknowledged, even appreciated. Jurors stole glances, officers shifted comfortably in their seats, and lawyers found themselves speaking with a touch more warmth than usual. The courtroom had begun the process of returning to seriousness, but it had been forever altered by this tiny human and a disciplined dog whose presence had touched everyone in subtle, unforgettable ways. By mid-morning, the story of the child and the dog had begun to spread quietly among those in the courtroom. Conversations during short breaks referenced the unusual scene. Some jurors recounted their smiles to neighbors, lawyers mentioned the moment in quiet asides, and officers reflected on how such a small interaction could leave a lasting impact on the mood of a room otherwise defined by rigid authority. The presence of Leela, pointing at Rex with innocence and joy, had created a subtle but undeniable bond among everyone present. Even as the day pressed on, the echoes of that brief pause lingered. Leela remained fascinated, Rex remained calm, and the courtroom remained transformed if only slightly. The magic of the moment, childlike wonder meeting disciplined loyalty, was a silent thread running through the room, reminding all that humanity often exists in the smallest gestures, in quiet observations, and in moments of genuine connection. It was a pause, yes, but a meaningful one, a quiet reminder of empathy, patience, and the simple power of innocence. The courtroom had begun to settle into a rhythm once again, but the atmosphere was subtly different from the morning's rigid seriousness. Leela, perched on her mother's lap, continued to observe Rex, the German shepherd, with fascination and quiet joy. Each small movement the dog made, a twitch of his ears, a shift in his posture, was enough to draw a soft giggle or an excited whisper from the 3-year-old. "Doggie's so big," she murmured, pressing her tiny hand against her mother for comfort. Samantha smiled, brushing back her daughter's curls. "Yes, honey, he's very big, but he's also very gentle," she whispered. Rex, ever composed, remained calm yet responsive. His brown eyes met Leela's gaze for brief moments, acknowledging her fascination with subtle intelligence. In that silent interaction, a connection formed, one that transcended the boundaries of species. The dog's calm demeanor contrasted with the tension-filled energy of the courtroom, and yet it harmonized with the innocence of a child who saw him not as a threat, but as a friend. The interplay of authority and innocence created a quiet, magnetic effect in the room. Jurors, lawyers, and officers began to notice the impact. A middle-aged juror, who had spent decades immersed in corporate litigation and legal procedure, allowed himself to smile quietly at the scene. Another juror leaned over to whisper to her neighbor, "I haven't smiled this much in a courtroom in years." Lawyers, usually hyper-focused on precise language and procedural maneuvering, felt their expressions soften as their eyes briefly drifted toward Leela and Rex. The court, a space designed for authority, logic, and rigid procedure, was being subtly transformed by a child's innocence and a dog's calm presence. Even the judge, who had maintained a strict expression for hours, could not entirely hide a faint smile. He adjusted his robes and tapped the gavel lightly, as if acknowledging the small, extraordinary interaction without disrupting the official proceedings. Leela's presence, paired with Rex's composure, had created a ripple effect, a moment that reminded everyone in the room that humanity often exists in the smallest gestures and quietest observations. During a short recess, the murmurs of the courtroom reflected the shared awareness of the extraordinary scene. "Look at her, she's completely captivated," whispered one officer to a colleague. "And Rex, he's just calm but responsive. You can tell he understands," replied the other. Even reporters in the gallery took note, scribbling observations that would later appear in human interest articles. The story unfolding in real time was one of innocence meeting professionalism, a reminder that even amidst tension and formality, warmth and empathy could ripple through a room. As testimony resumed, Leela's fascination continued unabated. She whispered small observations to her mother, "Doggie's looking at me." "He's nice, Mommy." Each comment was accompanied by a soft giggle or a shy wave. Samantha smiled down at her daughter, proud and touched. She had never expected that a courtroom, with all its strict rules and tense procedures, could become a space of gentle human connection. Yet here, through the lens of her daughter's perspective, the room felt more alive, more human, and subtly lighter. Rex remained still, yet entirely present. His body language was disciplined, but there was a quiet attentiveness that suggested he understood the weight of Leela's gaze. The K-9 officer standing nearby watched with pride. Rex had been trained for years to remain calm in chaotic or dangerous situations, but this was different. Here, he was a source of comfort, a bridge between innocence and authority, a living reminder that the smallest gestures could have enormous influence on those around him. The jurors' reactions were particularly telling. Many had spent the morning focused solely on the legal aspects of the case, their minds trained to observe facts, evidence, and testimony with unyielding precision. But the presence of a tiny child and a dog had introduced a new element: emotion. One juror, a young woman who had initially dreaded serving on the panel, whispered to her neighbor, "It's amazing. A child and a dog can remind us of what really matters." The neighbor nodded, his eyes softening. Across the room, others stole glances at the scene, each silently acknowledging the quiet power of innocence. Even the officers, trained to maintain composure and professionalism, allowed themselves subtle reactions. One shifted slightly, a small smile tugging at his lips. Another leaned forward, noticing the calm authority in Rex and the fascination in Leela. The balance of discipline and gentle curiosity created a rare harmony, a quiet energy that touched everyone present. No one spoke aloud, but the mood of the room had undeniably softened. Leela's presence and Rex's calm had become a lens through which everyone could briefly see beyond their roles and responsibilities. As the morning progressed, Leela's interactions remained simple yet profound. She whispered soft observations, pointed occasionally, and giggled quietly when Rex responded with the slightest movement, a head tilt, an attentive gaze. Each interaction was fleeting, yet powerful. Adults in the courtroom were subtly reminded of the importance of presence, patience, and observation. In a space dominated by authority, rules, and structured procedure, a child's innocence and a dog's composure introduced an energy that could not be ignored. During one particularly quiet moment, Leela leaned slightly forward, her finger pointing at Rex. She whispered, "Doggy, I like you." The German shepherd's ears flicked, his eyes meeting hers with a calm acknowledgement that seemed almost deliberate. Samantha whispered softly, "He likes you too, honey." The judge, noticing the quiet exchange, allowed a brief pause before resuming proceedings, tapping the gavel gently but with less severity than before. The subtle human connection lingered, a reminder that even in formal spaces, empathy and warmth could exist without disrupting the seriousness of the law. Reporters in the gallery began to recognize the scene as extraordinary. Cameras clicked discreetly, microphones captured the soft whispers, and notes were scribbled with a newfound focus on the human element rather than just legal arguments. One journalist whispered to a colleague, "This could be a headline: Child and police dog bring warmth to courtroom. It's unusual and people will love it." The colleague nodded quietly, understanding that this story, though simple, carried an emotional resonance far beyond the walls of the courthouse. As mid-morning turned into late morning, the courtroom maintained its function but carried a new rhythm. Leela's fascination with Rex had not only engaged her but subtly influenced everyone in the room. Lawyers spoke with a touch more warmth in their tone. Jurors leaned back with gentle smiles. Officers' stances relaxed slightly. And even the judge, authoritative as ever, seemed reminded of the human element beneath the formal proceedings. In those quiet, fleeting moments, a balance of innocence and discipline created a lasting impression. By the time recess arrived, Leela's cheeks were flushed with excitement. She whispered eagerly to her mother, "Can I pet him soon?" Samantha shook her head with a gentle smile. "Not yet, honey, but you can wave with your eyes and your hand." Leela's tiny fingers waved faintly, and Rex acknowledged her with the slightest flick of his ears. Even as people began to stretch, whisper quietly among themselves, or prepare for the next stage of proceedings, the memory of this interaction lingered in everyone's mind. It was clear, even to those who rarely allowed themselves sentiment, that the courtroom had been subtly changed. A 3-year-old child, fascinated by a dog, had introduced warmth and connection into a space designed for logic, order, and authority. The effect was invisible yet undeniable. Adults found themselves softer, more human, and more aware of the value of small, quiet gestures. Leela had reminded them all that innocence had a power that was often overlooked, and that a calm, attentive dog could be more than a partner in law enforcement. It could be a conduit for empathy. Even as lawyers and officers returned to their duties after the short recess, the emotional energy persisted. Leela whispered one final observation to her mother, "Doggy makes me happy." Samantha smiled, her heart swelling. "Yes, honey, he makes all of us happy too." Rex remained poised, his presence steady and dignified, as if understanding the importance of his role in this brief but powerful story. For those who witnessed it, the courtroom had been transformed, if only subtly, by a child's innocence and a dog's calm authority. As the morning stretched into afternoon, the quiet energy introduced by Leela and Rex continued to ripple throughout the courtroom. The legal proceedings progressed with the same careful precision, but something intangible had shifted. The judge's tone remained measured, but now it carried a subtle warmth. Lawyers delivered statements with the same professionalism, yet their expressions occasionally softened as they stole glances at the little girl and the German shepherd, whose quiet presence had become the heart of the room. Leela's fascination had not waned. Perched comfortably on her mother's lap, she leaned forward, pointing at Rex and whispering observations. "Doggy's ears are so soft," she murmured. Samantha smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Leela's face. "Yes, honey, he's trained to be gentle and calm." The simplicity of the statement belied the profound impact the interaction had on the courtroom. Leela's curiosity and Rex's disciplined response created a balance that was quietly transformative. The K-9 officer standing near Rex observed the interaction with a mixture of pride and astonishment. He had trained Rex for years to respond in high-stress situations, hostile encounters, chaotic crime scenes, and tense emergencies. But this was different. Here, in a room defined by law and procedure, Rex was not an enforcer but a calming presence, bridging the gap between authority and empathy. The officer exchanged a glance with Samantha, silently acknowledging the extraordinary subtlety of what was unfolding. Across the courtroom, jurors were noticing the effect as well. Many had spent hours focused solely on facts, evidence, and testimonies, yet the presence of a child so captivated by a dog had gently loosened the rigid tension that often dominated deliberation. One juror whispered to a neighbor, "I never expected to feel relaxed in a courtroom, but she's changed the energy." The neighbor nodded, eyes following Leela's gestures. Even the judge allowed a faint smile to break through his usual stern demeanor, the gavel tapping less sharply as proceedings continued. Outside the courtroom, word of the unusual scene had begun to spread. Reporters in the gallery discreetly typed notes and adjusted their cameras, sensing a story with human interest that went beyond the technicalities of the case. One journalist whispered to a colleague, "This isn't just about the trial anymore. A 3-year-old and a police dog. People will love this." Cameras adjusted lenses subtly, capturing the interactions between child and dog without disrupting the courtroom's decorum. Microphones recorded the soft murmurs, the quiet giggles, and the attentive posture of Rex, which together created an almost cinematic tableau of innocence meeting discipline. As testimony continued, Leela's quiet engagement drew the attention of others in unexpected ways. Witnesses, previously nervous and formal, occasionally glanced at the scene with curiosity. One elderly man, awaiting his turn to testify, smiled softly at the little girl, recalling perhaps his own childhood experiences with animals. The courtroom, usually a place of rigidity, had become a subtle stage for human connection. Leela, oblivious to the power she wielded, continued to whisper observations and giggle softly whenever Rex responded with the tiniest movement. At one point, Rex shifted slightly, not out of command, but as if acknowledging Leela's enthusiasm. His calm, steady gaze met her wide eyes, and for a moment the room collectively paused. The energy, previously tense and formal, softened palpably. Lawyers paused mid-sentence, jurors leaned back, and even the stenographer's fingers hesitated above the keys. The brief pause was enough to remind everyone that a courtroom is not only a place of law, but also a space where humanity can quietly emerge, even amid seriousness and authority. Samantha whispered to Leela, "He likes you, honey. See how calm he is." Leela's face lit up with a shy grin. "I like him too," she murmured. The simplicity of the exchange, so innocent and uncalculated, resonated beyond mother and daughter. Across the room, officers, jurors, and even the judge noticed the quiet bond forming. For a moment, the courtroom was not just a legal arena but a shared human space, subtly infused with warmth and empathy. The journalists, ever observant, began documenting the unfolding story with a sense of anticipation. "This is going to make a great piece," one whispered, typing quickly on a laptop. "A child, a police dog, and a courtroom. The contrast is perfect." Photographers captured small gestures, the tilt of Rex's head, Leela's pointing finger, the tiny smile that broke across her face when the dog acknowledged her. Though no one in the courtroom spoke aloud about the emotional impact, the story was unfolding silently, threading itself into the consciousness of everyone present. During a brief break in proceedings, Samantha allowed Leela to whisper excitedly about Rex. "Mommy, can I say hi to him after this?" Leela asked, eyes sparkling. Samantha shook her head gently but smiled. "Not yet, honey, but you can keep looking at him and waving with your eyes." Leela giggled softly, pressing her small hand to her chest, overwhelmed with joy. Even in that small, contained moment, the emotional power of innocence was evident to anyone who watched. The courtroom, now halfway through the day, continued to carry the quiet imprint of Leela and Rex's interaction. Lawyers spoke with a fraction more warmth in their tone, jurors relaxed slightly in their chairs, and officers exuded a calm confidence. The subtle energy created by this unlikely pair had transformed the space without disrupting the necessary order of the court. What had started as a child's curiosity and a dog's calm attentiveness had grown into a pervasive, gentle influence, felt by every person in the room. Witnesses, when called to testify, seemed subtly affected as well. Some paused, catching sight of the child pointing at the dog, and found themselves softening, even unconsciously. The presence of Leela and Rex had created an environment where tension could be mitigated, not by distraction, but by the quiet assertion of innocence and dignity. Even those who had expected a rigid, emotionless day could not ignore the subtle warmth pervading the courtroom. By mid-afternoon, the story had begun to take on life beyond the walls of the courthouse. Journalists, notes and photographs hinted at a narrative of human interest, one where innocence met authority, and where a trained K-9 officer became a bridge to empathy. Social media posts and early news alerts would later highlight the interaction, though those inside the courtroom remained focused on the legal proceedings. Yet for those present, the experience was deeply personal, a quiet memory etched into the minds of adults accustomed to strict decorum. Leela continued to point at Rex, whispering softly. "Doggy, look," she murmured. Rex, maintaining his professional composure, shifted slightly to meet her gaze. The subtle acknowledgement was enough for Leela to erupt into a quiet, musical giggle, a sound that resonated gently through the room. It was a reminder to everyone present that joy and curiosity, even in the smallest forms, had the power to pierce tension, soften hardened expressions, and create shared moments of warmth in unexpected places. Even as proceedings resumed, with legal arguments continuing in measured cadence, the influence of the child and the dog persisted. Officers, jurors, and lawyers were aware, even subconsciously, of the gentle energy threading through the courtroom. The presence of innocence and calm provided a subtle reminder that, while rules and authority governed the day, human connection could never be entirely contained or ignored. By the end of the afternoon, the scene between Leela and Rex had become a quietly iconic image within the courthouse. A small child's fascination, paired with a trained dog's calm dignity, had altered the mood in ways both visible and imperceptible. For everyone present, the experience reinforced a universal truth, that even in spaces defined by order, seriousness, and procedure, innocence and empathy could leave a lasting, transformative mark. By mid-afternoon, the courtroom had been quietly transformed. The formal tension that had dominated the morning had softened into a rhythm of curiosity, empathy, and subtle warmth. Jurors leaned back in their chairs with softened expressions. Lawyers spoke with slightly more measured tones, and even the stenographer allowed herself occasional smiles between keystrokes. At the center of this subtle shift were Leela and Rex, the small child and the German shepherd, whose quiet interaction had captured the attention of everyone present. Leela's fascination had grown steadily throughout the day. Her tiny hands pointed repeatedly at Rex, whispering soft, delighted observations. "Doggy, big ears," she murmured. "Look at him, Mommy." Samantha, watching closely, whispered back reassuringly, "Yes, honey, he sees you. Just keep being quiet, okay?" Leela's wide eyes reflected pure wonder, her innocent engagement holding a strange, unspoken authority over the mood of the room. Rex, trained for years to respond to commands and maintain composure under stress, now demonstrated a different kind of attentiveness. His gaze followed Leela subtly, his ears twitching ever so slightly when she whispered or pointed. Though he did not move toward her, the simple acknowledgement was enough to captivate her attention. In that silent communication, the courtroom began to experience something rare, a human moment breaking through the rigidity of authority. The judge, previously stern and unyielding, noticed the subtle shift as well. He cleared his throat and tapped the gavel lightly before speaking. "It seems today we have a reminder that even in serious spaces, small gestures and moments of connection matter." His words were soft but deliberate, a reflection of the quiet influence Leela and Rex had created. The courtroom, once solely focused on evidence, procedure, and argument, now carried a layer of human emotion woven through every interaction. Jurors who had spent hours immersed in testimony began to exchange glances, quietly acknowledging the effect. One juror, a middle-aged man who had been especially focused on legal details, leaned slightly toward his neighbor and whispered, "I never thought I'd smile like this in a courtroom." The neighbor smiled in response, her eyes drawn repeatedly to the little girl and the German shepherd. The human presence of innocence, juxtaposed with the calm authority of a trained dog, had created a subtle yet powerful influence that pervaded the room. Even the lawyers, usually unyielding in their focus, were not immune. One attorney, mid-sentence, paused briefly as his gaze caught Leela pointing excitedly at Rex. The gesture, so simple yet so profound, reminded him that the people in the room were more than professionals performing duties. They were humans capable of emotion, reflection, and connection. His voice softened slightly as he continued, and even a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Rex remained composed, an anchor of calm amidst the subtle emotional swell. The K-9 officer standing nearby observed the growing effect with quiet pride. Rex had been trained to respond to commands, to act under stress, and to project authority without aggression. But what he was demonstrating now went beyond training. It was empathy, attentiveness, and presence. The dog's ability to create calm through mere presence, to respond to innocence without distraction, had altered the room in ways that no words or formalities could replicate. As the trial continued, the story of Leela and Rex began to spread quietly. Media representatives in the gallery scribbled notes, capturing small details: the tilt of Rex's head, the delighted giggle of the child, and the subtle smiles forming across the courtroom. A reporter whispered to a colleague, "This isn't just a courtroom story, it's human interest gold. People will connect with it instantly." Another nodded, quietly framing her shot, careful to maintain decorum while capturing the quiet magic of the moment. At one point, a witness paused mid-testimony, glancing toward Leela and Rex. The witness, an older man, smiled faintly, recalling perhaps his own childhood experiences with dogs. "It's incredible," he whispered to the court officer beside him. "You can feel the calmness, it's contagious." His observation, though quiet, seemed to echo the sentiment in the room. The energy had shifted imperceptibly but unmistakably. The authority of law remained, but it was now tempered by human connection and shared emotion. Leela, sensing the attention, leaned forward again. "Doggy, look at me," she whispered. Her voice, small but musical, carried across the room, drawing the gaze of jurors, lawyers, and officers alike. Rex acknowledged her with the faintest flick of his ears, and her tiny giggle erupted, pure and unrestrained. In that instant, the courtroom experienced a collective pause. The tension that had defined the day earlier seemed to lift, replaced by a gentle recognition of something far more profound than legal arguments: the power of innocence, curiosity, and empathy. Samantha whispered softly, "See, honey, everyone's noticing how special you are." Leela's eyes sparkled, her fingers waving faintly in Rex's direction. The dog remained poised, steady, and attentive, the perfect counterbalance to the child's uncontained excitement. In this simple interaction, the courtroom was no longer solely a space of judgment and procedure. It had become a living narrative of connection, trust, and subtle joy. The judge, observing the energy shift, allowed a small, deliberate pause in the proceedings. "Perhaps," he said softly, "we could take a moment to recognize that even in serious matters, the human element matters greatly." His words were met with subtle nods throughout the room. Jurors leaned back slightly, officers relaxed their posture, and lawyers allowed small smiles to form. Even the stenographer, fingers poised above the keys, felt the weight of warmth threading through the courtroom's formal structure. As the afternoon progressed, the courtroom became increasingly attuned to the quiet power of the scene. Leela's fascination with Rex never waned, her whispers and gestures punctuating the formal rhythm of the day with gentle joy. Rex, in turn, continued to display disciplined attentiveness, responding to her engagement with subtle acknowledgement. The dynamic was mesmerizing, a contrast of innocence and authority that reminded everyone present of the humanity often overlooked in the pursuit of procedure and order. Reporters in the gallery began taking notes in earnest, recognizing that the story extended beyond legal proceedings. "It's the human element that will resonate," one whispered. "The little girl, the dog, the courtroom, it's magic in its simplest form." Cameras focused carefully, capturing moments that would later be described in articles, social media posts, and even broadcast segments. Yet the real impact was immediate, felt by every person present in the room, tangible yet unspoken. By late afternoon, the courtroom's mood had shifted significantly. Witnesses spoke with a touch more ease, jurors exchanged quiet glances and smiles, and even lawyers carried a gentleness in their tone that had been absent earlier in the day. Layla, oblivious to the impact she had created, continued to point at Rex and whisper softly, her giggles threading through the serious space like a delicate melody. In her presence, the courtroom became more than a space of procedure. It had become a stage for empathy, connection, and subtle joy. As proceedings drew toward a short recess, Samantha whispered to Leela, "Soon, honey, you'll get to say hello to Rex outside." Leela's eyes sparkled with anticipation. The tiny girl, through her innocence and curiosity, had not only captivated a disciplined police dog but had also transformed the emotional energy of the courtroom. The day had begun with tension, authority, and strict procedure. But now, thanks to a child and a dog, the space was infused with warmth, reflection, and a quiet sense of shared humanity. Even as lawyers prepared their notes for the next segment, and the judge tapped his gavel lightly to maintain order, the effect of Leela and Rex lingered. The courtroom had been subtly reshaped by innocence and calm, a reminder that authority, procedure, and seriousness need not exclude the human heart. The day's events had created a living memory, an invisible imprint on everyone present, demonstrating that even in rigid spaces, empathy, curiosity, and joy could flourish. The courtroom had changed completely by late afternoon. The formality of earlier hours had softened into a rhythm of warmth, curiosity, and quiet joy, all anchored by Leela and Rex. Even the most stoic jurors had been drawn into the gentle energy radiating from the child and the German shepherd. Conversations had slowed, eyes had softened, and the atmosphere, once tense and procedural, now carried a subtle undercurrent of human connection. Leela, still perched on her mother's lap, leaned forward slightly, her tiny finger pointing at Rex. "Doggy, hi," she whispered, her voice almost musical in its delight. Rex, trained to perfection yet full of natural sensitivity, lifted his head just enough to meet her gaze. His steady brown eyes seemed to say, "I see you, little one," and Leela giggled softly, her joy spilling quietly through the courtroom. Samantha smiled down at her daughter. "See, he likes you, honey. You're making him happy too." Leela's face lit up with pure wonder. The simplicity of the moment, an innocent child connecting with a dog, had created a ripple effect that had touched everyone present. Jurors, officers, lawyers, and even the judge had felt it. A shared human experience had entered a space usually governed by rules, procedure, and serious deliberation. The judge, noticing the pervasive warmth, allowed a small, deliberate pause. "Let us take a moment," he said softly, "to recognize that sometimes, even the smallest gestures can have the greatest impact." His words, calm and thoughtful, resonated deeply in the room. It was an acknowledgement not of legal precedent, but of humanity itself. Jurors nodded quietly, officers adjusted their stances with subtle ease, and lawyers allowed small smiles to form as they looked toward the child and the dog. Rex, always poised and disciplined, remained a calm anchor. But in that moment, his presence carried more than authority. It carried reassurance, empathy, and the ability to bring subtle joy. The K-9 officer, standing nearby, glanced at Samantha and Leela. He couldn't help but feel pride. Rex had not only performed his duty as a trained police dog, but had also demonstrated an extraordinary capacity for gentle connection. Leela's innocent fascination had drawn it out, creating a bond that transcended words. Jurors whispered softly among themselves during the pause, noting how rare it was to experience such a profound yet delicate moment in a courtroom. One juror, a man who had spent decades in litigation, whispered, "I've never felt anything like this. A child and a dog can change the mood completely." His neighbor smiled, her eyes still following Leela's gestures. The courtroom, once a stage of rigid formality, had become a shared space for emotion, connection, and reflection. Even witnesses, who had previously been nervous or formal, were subtly influenced. Some paused mid-testimony to glance at the child pointing at Rex, and the smallest of smiles appeared on faces hardened by stress. Leela's innocence reminded everyone that empathy often exists in the quietest gestures, and Rex's calm authority gave the room a grounding energy. Together, the child and the dog had demonstrated that presence and attentiveness could have a power all their own. Reporters in the gallery, sensing a unique story unfolding, discreetly documented the scene. Cameras focused on the quiet interaction, the tilt of Rex's head, Leela's tiny hand pointing, and the delicate sparkle of delight in her eyes. Notes were typed rapidly, recording the subtle but profound emotional impact. One journalist whispered, "This isn't just a courtroom story. It's about humanity, empathy, and connection. People will feel it." Her colleague nodded, adjusting her lens carefully to capture the essence without disrupting the delicate mood. Leela's whispers continued, "Doggy, look at me, I like you." Samantha leaned closer, whispering softly, "He likes you too, honey. You're making everyone happy." The child's eyes sparkled with understanding, though not fully grasping the full extent of the effect she had created. Yet the courtroom, adults and officials alike, felt it acutely. In this moment, innocence and calm had bridged gaps that procedure, authority, and responsibility could not. The judge allowed the proceedings to continue, but with a gentler rhythm, recognizing the lingering influence of Leela and Rex. Lawyers spoke with measured warmth, witnesses offered testimony with slightly more ease, and jurors leaned forward occasionally, soft smiles appearing when Leela whispered or giggled. Even the court officers maintained a subtle lightness in their posture, demonstrating the quiet impact of human connection in a formal environment. As the trial reached its final stages for the day, Samantha suggested to Leela, "Soon, honey, you'll get to meet Rex." Leela's face lit up immediately. "Can I pet him?" she asked, her voice tinged with excitement. Samantha shook her head gently. Not yet, but you can wave and say hello. Leela waved her tiny hand enthusiastically, and Rex's ears flicked ever so slightly in acknowledgement. The small, silent communication seemed to resonate throughout the room, a shared understanding between innocence and discipline. Even as the final testimonies were given, the quiet energy persisted. Jurors reflected on the unusual experience of the day, carrying with them an awareness that the courtroom was more than a place of authority. It was a place where humanity could quietly emerge. Officers and lawyers alike felt the subtle warmth, recognizing that the smallest gestures often held the greatest power. The combination of Leela's childlike fascination and Rex's disciplined calm had created a lasting impression, one that extended far beyond the immediate legal context. When the day finally drew to a close, the courtroom had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. Leela, delighted and full of energy, waved again at Rex. The dog, calm and steady, gave the faintest acknowledgement, his gaze meeting hers one last time before the group began to exit. Samantha whispered, "Tomorrow, honey, you'll get your special moment with him." Leela nodded eagerly, her small face radiant with joy. The bond between child and dog, though brief, had left an indelible mark on the room. Outside the courtroom, the media eagerly recorded the final moments. Photographers and reporters documented the small but significant gestures, the wave of a tiny hand, the tilt of a dog's head, the sparkle of innocent delight in a child's eyes. News stories would later highlight the remarkable interaction, emphasizing how a simple connection had transformed a space defined by tension and authority. The story would inspire readers across the country, reminding them of the enduring power of innocence, empathy, and connection. For the officers and courthouse staff, the day had been unforgettable. They reflected quietly on the subtle yet profound influence a child and a dog could have in such a structured environment. Leela had reminded them of the value of presence, attention, and human connection. Rex had demonstrated the power of calm, steady authority combined with empathy, showing that discipline need not be cold or distant. Together, they had created a moment of quiet magic, a shared human experience that everyone in the room would carry forward. As the last few people exited the courtroom, the soft echo of Leela's giggles and Rex's calm gaze lingered in memory. The day had been marked by seriousness and authority, yet punctuated by moments of innocence and joy that had reshaped the atmosphere completely. The story of the 3-year-old pointing at a police dog had become a symbol, not of the trial itself, but of the enduring power of empathy, connection, and shared humanity. Even in the weeks that followed, the impact of that day continued to ripple. Jurors recalled the soft smiles, officers remembered the quiet warmth, and lawyers reflected on how a small child and a dog could transform a space traditionally defined by tension and authority. The media coverage, though secondary to the human experience, captured the imagination of the public, highlighting the remarkable effect of innocence and calm on a structured environment. Samantha, walking hand in hand with Leela outside the courthouse, smiled at the memory. "You made everyone happy today," she whispered. Leela beamed. "Doggy happy too," she replied. It was true, the gentle acknowledgement between child and dog had touched more hearts than anyone could have anticipated. Rex's calm and attentive presence, combined with Leela's innocence, had created a moment that transcended the walls of the courtroom, leaving a lasting impression on everyone who had witnessed it. As they left the building, Samantha glanced back. The courtroom, once filled with formality and tension, had been transformed, if only for a day. And for those who had been present, the memory of that quiet, magical connection between a child and a dog would remain, a reminder that, even in the most serious of spaces, warmth, empathy, and the simple power of innocence could change everything.